My name is Dara Whitson. I am 31 years old. For 6 years, I worked as a licensed forensic accountant for the federal government, tracing money that was never supposed to be found. I have sat across the table from people who smiled at me while hiding millions in offshore accounts. I have built cases that sent executives to prison. I know how to read a paper trail the way other people read a face. But none of that prepared me for the morning I opened my mother's medical file and realized my own sister had been stealing from her for almost 2 years. And it happened the way most terrible things happen, quietly, at first, disguised as love. I still remember sitting in the waiting room of the elder care attorney's office, fluorescent lights, the kind of carpet that looks gray, no matter what color it started as. My sister sitting 2 chairs away from me, her hands folded in her lap, her expression perfectly composed. Patient, practiced. She had always been the composed one. Even as kids, she never raised her voice. She just waited until you stopped paying attention. And then she moved. The attorney read my mother's amended power of attorney out loud. My name wasn't in it. It had been removed, apparently, 14 months earlier. My sister's name was the only one left. She had signed it on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in Cincinnati testifying before a grand jury. I looked at her. She looked at the wall. And I made a decision in that moment not to speak, not yet, because I knew something she didn't know. I knew, and I needed it to stay that way for just a little while longer. My mother had her first stroke 2.5 years ago. Nothing catastrophic. She recovered well, mostly. But she had gaps after that, hours that blurred, words that slipped. She lived alone in the house she and my father had owned for 38 years, a 3-bedroom Cape Cod in Wheaton, Illinois, the kind of house that held a specific gravity. Every family holiday, every argument, every version of who we were before we got old enough to choose differently. My sister had always been closer to home. That was the story anyway. I traveled for work. She stayed. She was the one who took our mother to her cardiology appointments, the one who organized the pill boxes, the one who set up the grocery delivery. When I called, my mother talked about her the way people talk about saints, with that particular exhaustion that comes from being well cared for. I believed it because I wanted to. The first sign came 7 months ago when my mother mentioned, almost by accident, that she'd had trouble paying her heating bill. My mother owned her house outright. She had a pension from 30 years of teaching. She had a small portfolio my father had built before he died. She was not a woman who struggled with utility bills. I asked her about it gently. She got confused, said my sister had explained it to her, something about a consolidation, something about making things easier to manage. She used my sister's exact phrasing, which meant she had been taught what to say without fully understanding it. I called my sister that night. She said my mother was fine. She said I was reading too much into things. She said, and I will never forget this, that it was a little hard to weigh in when I wasn't the one actually there. I let it go. I shouldn't have. But I did. The second sign came 3 months later. I was visiting for Thanksgiving, and I noticed a statement on the kitchen counter. Not hidden, just left there carelessly, the way people leave things when they've stopped worrying about being caught. It was from my mother's brokerage account. The balance was less than half what it had been the last time I'd seen it, 2 years prior. I took a photo of it before anyone saw me. I folded the moment up and put it away. I didn't say anything at dinner. I smiled. I helped with the dishes. I drove back to my apartment in the city that night and I did not sleep. Because I had spent 6 years following money, and I already knew what this looked like. The next 4 months were the loneliest of my life. I couldn't go to my mother because she trusted my sister completely, and any warning from me would go straight back to her. I couldn't go to the police, not yet, because suspicion isn't evidence. I couldn't tell my aunt or my cousins because my sister had spent years carefully positioning herself as the responsible one, the caregiver, the martyr. And I was the one who'd left. I was the one who'd chosen a career over proximity, who always had a work call on Christmas Eve, who didn't come home often enough. I had already lost the narrative. I needed facts. So I started quietly. I requested my own copy of my mother's financial records. I was still listed as a secondary account holder on one of her older checking accounts, which gave me limited access. What I found in that account alone was enough to make my stomach drop. Regular transfers out. Never a round number. Always something like $1,847, 3,213, amounts designed to look like bills being paid, but the recipients were wrong. Transfers to an LLC I didn't recognize. Payments to a property management company that, when I searched for it, had no public address and no reviews and a registered agent in Delaware. My sister had a name for the LLC. I found it eventually. She'd formed it 8 months after our mother's stroke. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning looking at this, and I thought about all the Sundays I had spent at my mother's house as a child. The two of us doing the crossword puzzle together, her handwriting small and precise in the margins when she wasn't sure of an answer. I thought about the way she still called me on my birthday and sang the whole song all the way through, even now. And something in me went very, very still. This wasn't about money. It was about the fact that someone had looked at a woman in her 70s with a softening mind and decided she was useful. I kept working. I pulled property records. My sister's name had been added to the deed of our mother's house, not as a joint tenant, but as a co-owner, which under Illinois law meant she could eventually force a sale. The date of that transfer was a Saturday. Our mother's neurologist had documented cognitive concerns at an appointment 4 days earlier. I printed that record. I put it in a folder. I built the folder the way I build every case, one document at a time. No assumptions, just the paper telling its own story. The threats when they came weren't dramatic. My sister called me one evening and said very casually that she'd heard I'd been asking questions. She said it the way you'd mentioned the weather. She said she hoped I wasn't going to make things hard for Mom, that stress wasn't good for someone in her condition, that it'd be a shame if our mother had to deal with family conflict at this stage of her life. I said, of course not. I just want to make sure she's okay. My sister said, she's fine. I take care of her. After she hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time, because that was the threat, not a raised voice, not a warning, just a reminder of what she could do if she needed to position me as the source of harm, the disruptive one, the daughter who came home and caused trouble. I knew that play. I had watched other people run it in other contexts. What she didn't know was that I had already contacted an elder law attorney, and that I had already sent my documentation to an attorney who specialized in financial exploitation of vulnerable adults, and that 2 weeks earlier I had sat with my mother on her couch and very gently, over 2 hours, gone through the documents with her. Not all of them, just enough. My mother had cried, not because she was surprised, exactly, but because I think some part of her had known and had not let herself finish the thought. She signed an affidavit that afternoon. Her handwriting was still small and precise. The hearing was a Thursday morning in October. Family court, because the dispute was technically a conservatorship proceeding. My sister had filed to be named sole conservator of our mother's estate, which would have given her legal authority over every financial decision going forward. I arrived early. I wore the gray blazer I wear when I testify, not to perform, just because it was what I put on when I needed to be exactly who I am. My sister arrived with an attorney. She had clearly prepared. She had documents of her own, caregiver logs, receipts for groceries and prescriptions, a letter from a neighbor attesting to how often she visited. She looked tired in the way people look when they've been carrying something they didn't expect to become this heavy. The attorney made the case for conservatorship. He talked about my absence. He talked about the complexities of managing care for a parent with cognitive decline. He talked about the disruption that contested proceedings could cause for a vulnerable person. He was good. He was organized. He used the word stability 6 times. I counted. I let him finish. I let my sister's body language settle into something like confidence. And then, when the judge asked if I had anything to submit, I stood up. I didn't give a speech. I had learned a long time ago that speeches are for people who don't have the documents. I had a single exhibit packet, organized, tabbed, labeled. I placed it on the clerk's desk and asked that it be entered into the record. The judge took his time. He was a deliberate man, the kind of judge who does not perform for the room. He turned pages. He stopped on several of them. He turned back to one page near the middle and read it twice. Then he set the packet down and looked at my sister's attorney. "Counsel," he said, "I'm going to need to pause this proceeding." He called a brief recess. When we came back, there were two additional people in the room, an investigator from the Illinois Adult Protective Services and a representative from the state attorney's office. I hadn't known they would be there. My attorney had, but hadn't told me. She said later she didn't want me to perform relief. She wanted me to just be ready. The judge addressed my sister directly. His voice was even and precise. He said that based on the financial records submitted, he was referring the matter for criminal investigation and that the conservatorship petition was denied. He said a temporary guardian ad litem would be appointed to manage my mother's affairs during the investigation. My sister didn't say anything. Her attorney whispered something to her, and she shook her head slightly, like she was trying to clear water from her ears. I sat down. My hands were flat on the table. I wasn't thinking about winning. I was thinking about my mother, who had asked me that morning before I left the house whether I thought the tulips would come back this spring. I had told her yes. I was almost certain they would. The weeks after the hearing were not peaceful. There is a version of the story where the truth comes out and everything resolves cleanly, where the guilty party confesses and the family rallies and the person who was wronged gets to feel vindicated and whole. That is not what happened. My sister did not confess. She hired a different attorney. She told our aunt that I had fabricated documents, that I was jealous, that I had always resented her relationship with our mother. Our aunt called me, her voice careful and strained, and asked if any of it was true. I told her I couldn't talk about it while the investigation was open. She said she understood, but she didn't sound like she understood. I went back to my apartment after those calls and I cooked dinner and I ate it standing at the counter because I didn't feel like sitting down. And I thought about what it costs to do the right thing when the right thing makes you the villain in someone else's story. I thought about my mother, who was now living with a court-appointed care manager coordinating her finances, who called me every few days and sometimes sounded like herself and sometimes didn't. I thought about my sister and how she used to let me borrow her bicycle when we were small, before the distance between us had grown to something permanent. I thought about the way she used to call me on my bad days in college and say nothing useful but stay on the phone anyway. And I thought about how people break, not all at once, slowly, over years, under pressures that started before either of us had the language to describe them. My sister had lived in the shadow of our mother's needs for years. She had done real work. She had also, somewhere in the middle of doing that work, started to feel entitled to something for it. And entitlement, when it meets opportunity and a mind that knows how to justify, becomes something else entirely. I didn't forgive her. I'm not at the part of this story where I do that. But I stopped hating her cleanly, which is its own complicated thing. The investigation took 4 months. I cooperated fully. I submitted every document, every record, every photograph I had taken on that Thanksgiving visit. I answered every question. The final accounting was this. My sister had transferred approximately $94,000 from my mother's accounts over 22 months. Some of it had gone into the LLC, which had no legitimate business activity. Some of it had been used to pay down her own mortgage. A smaller amount had gone toward what appeared to be personal expenses, a vacation, furniture, a car repair. The house deed transfer was reversed. The LLC was dissolved. She was charged with financial exploitation of an elderly person, which in Illinois is a Class 1 felony. The case is still making its way through the courts. I don't know how it will end. My mother knows what happened. She doesn't ask me about it often. When she does, I answer honestly, and then I change the subject and she lets me. She has a good care manager now. Her accounts are stable. She called me last week to tell me she'd seen a cardinal in the yard and wanted me to know. I wrote it down in a notepad I keep on my desk. The date, the detail. I don't know why. It felt important to record it somewhere. I started a small financial literacy program 2 months after the hearing. Nothing formal. I partner with two elder law attorneys and a social worker who specializes in adult protective services. We run Saturday workshops at a library branch on the north side. Free, open to anyone. Focused on helping older adults and their families understand the documents they're signing, the accounts they're sharing access to, the flags that suggest something might be wrong. I'm not going to tell you it changes everything. Most Saturdays we get 12 or 15 people. Some of them are worried children. Some of them are older adults who came alone. Occasionally, someone comes in and describes a situation that sounds a lot like what happened in my family, and I have to keep my face neutral while I hand them the right brochure and the right phone number. But sometimes, someone comes in who caught something early, who noticed a number that didn't look right, who trusted that instinct before it became a crisis. And I feel something then that I don't have a clean word for. Not vindication. Not quite. Something smaller and more durable than that. The envelope came on a weekday in February, forwarded through the social worker's office. No return address. I almost set it aside for later, but something made me open it right then, standing at the kitchen counter. Inside was a card, handmade, the kind a child might make. Construction paper, careful block letters, a drawing of a house and a tree and two stick figures with what I think were supposed to be big smiles. On the inside, an adult had written, "My mother almost signed over power of attorney to someone who had been stealing from her for 3 years. We found out because of your workshop. Because of you, she still has her savings. She still has her home. We didn't know who else to tell. So we're telling you." I read it twice, then I folded it and held it in both hands for a moment, not moving. I thought about my mother singing to me on the phone on my birthday, all the way through, every year, even now. I thought about tulips coming back in spring. I thought about how quiet the fight for someone's dignity can look from the outside. No headlines, no moment that anyone photographs, just paperwork and patience and showing up. I put the card in a folder I keep separate from the work files. It's getting full. Some things are worth keeping track of. I still don't sleep perfectly. I still have nights where I replay conversations, where I second guess the moments I waited instead of speaking, where I wonder if I could have caught it earlier and what would be different if I had. But I wake up in the morning and I go to the desk and I open the folder when I need to remember why. And most days, that's enough to keep going. People ask me sometimes whether I feel like I won. I never know how to answer that, because winning implies there was something to celebrate at the end, and there wasn't. There was just a quieter version of a life that used to have more people in it. What I keep coming back to is this. My sister didn't start out trying to destroy anything, I believe that. She started out tired and resentful and underpaid for years of real work, and somewhere in that exhaustion she made a small compromise with herself. Just this once. Just a little. And then the next time was easier, and the time after that easier still, until she had built something she couldn't see clearly anymore because she'd been inside it too long. That's how it usually goes. Not a villain waking up one morning and deciding to be one. Just a person who stopped asking themselves a hard question often enough and then stopped asking it at all. I'm not saying that excuses anything. It doesn't. $94,000, my mother's home, 2 years of quiet erosion. Those are facts that exist independent of anyone's internal narrative. But understanding how something happened is different from forgiving it, and I think people sometimes confuse the two. I understand it. I'm nowhere near forgiving it. And I've had to make peace with the fact that those two things can be true at the same time. What I learned, not from this situation but through it, is that integrity is mostly invisible. It doesn't announce itself. It's the choice you make in the dark when no one is watching and you have a justification already prepared. My sister had that moment probably more than once, and she chose the justification. I've had those moments too, in smaller stakes, and I'm not certain I always chose right. That's the part that keeps me honest. The truer lesson, maybe, is about attention. My mother needed someone to pay attention, and I told myself that showing up meant something different than being present. I was far away, and I called and I visited when I could, and I believed that was enough. It wasn't. Not because I'm a bad daughter, but because distance creates gaps, and gaps are where things go wrong without anyone meaning them to. I think about Dara Whitson, about who I was before this happened, and I recognize someone who was competent and confident and genuinely good at her work and had quietly stopped applying that same rigor to her personal life. I watched other people's money like a hawk. I signed off on my mother's accounts for a year without really looking. That's the thing about skill. It doesn't transfer automatically. You have to choose to use it every time, even when you're tired and it's your own family and you'd rather just believe things are fine. They weren't fine. And the only reason I know that now, The only reason my mother still has her house and her savings and her tulips coming up in the yard each spring is because at some point I got uncomfortable enough to look. Not because I was brave, because I was unsettled, and I followed the feeling. That's what I'd tell anyone in a situation that feels wrong, but not quite wrong enough to act on yet. Follow the feeling, look at the paper, ask the question that makes you nervous to ask. The discomfort you feel before you look is almost always smaller than the cost of not looking. And take care of the people who need you to actually show up. Not to call, not to mean well from a distance. To show up and pay attention and ask the boring specific questions about heating bills and account balances and who has been added to what deed. That's it. That's the whole thing. Everything else is just paperwork.